Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Dan Masters. I'm your presenter for this evening. We're talk about my new book, Hell by the Acre, which is a narrative history of the Stones River campaign. A little bit about me. I am a native of northwestern Ohio. I live in Perrysburg, Ohio, with my wife, Amy, and four of our six children. Two of them have flown the nest, so to speak. My oldest son is serving in the United States Air Force down in South Carolina. And my oldest daughter just recently graduated from nursing school and is got her position at Toledo Hospital as a labor and delivery nurse. I am a graduate of the University of Toledo and have spent 30 years in manufacturing, most of that in the supply chain space. Current roles as a global planning manager. But what really gets me up every morning and kind of keeps me going on things is this connection with the American Civil War. I am the descendant of five Union veterans of the war. Three of those veterans served in the Army of the Cumberland. I had two ancestors from Ohio and three from Indiana. All of them did survive the war. If they had not, I would not be here. And I've spent over 25 years studying the conflict. Um, this is, one of the people may be aware of me because of the Civil War blog, Dan Master Civil War Chronicles, which I've been publishing now since 2017. And at last count, we're at 977 blog posts so there's a little bit of everything out there, a lot of focus on the Western theater, and the war is viewed from the ranks, which is really kind of really become my contribution and my study in the Civil War has been highlighting the soldier experience. Hell by the Acre is my 11th published book. It is the first one that I've published with Savas Beatty. Obviously, we're very, very delighted to be able to be here tonight to talk with you about that. Personal connection with the Battle of Stones River. The closest one is this dapper-looking gentleman here sitting in a wicker chair. This is my great-great-grandfather, James Parker Brown. James Parker Brown served as a private in Company D of the 37th Indiana Infantry for almost 4 years. He enlisted in late 1861 and didn't come home until the end of July 1865. But that said, he took part in the fighting at Stones River. If we go out to the park and go out to tour stop number 2, when you go out there amongst those limestone outcroppings and whatnot, that's around where the 37th Indiana fought on December 31st. They also took part in the fighting on January 2nd, but Grandpa Brown was there. Another ancestor, Grandpa Brown's on my mom's side. On my dad's side, there was a gentleman named James Morrow, who was a private in Company H of the 1st Ohio Cavalry. That is who is depicted in this piece of art. It was drawn by Nathan Finnegan, who is a soldier in the 1st Ohio Cavalry. And what he is depicting is the 1st Ohio's cavalry charge at Stones River. And in that charge, Colonel Minor Milliken was killed in hand-to-hand combat with a soldier in the 8th Texas Cavalry. Grandpa Morrow was there with them. He was in the ranks in Company H and was present when Colonel Milliken was killed and survived the battle and survived the war. The third family member that we had that was connected with Stones River did not survive the battle. This is my fourth great uncle, again on my mother's side. His name was James McClargan, not Joseph McClargan, as it says there on the stone. But he was serving as a private in Company C of the 21st Ohio Infantry, fighting in the same brigade as Grandpa Brown and his 37th Indiana. The families were not related at this point. I really doubt the men knew one another. But Uncle Jim, as we call him, was mortally wounded in the head at Stones River and that fighting in the Cedars on December 31st. And he passed away a few weeks later in Nashville. His date of death is a bit of a mystery. The official records from the National Archives list 3 different dates that he died. It was either January 11th, January 20th, or June 20th. I kind of suspect with a head wound, he probably didn't last until June, but that said, he is buried at Nashville National Cemetery. and where he was in the hospital in Nashville after Stones River and then passed away. So, what is Stones River? Well, the Stones River campaign is one of the bloodiest engagements of the war. It offered as the second bloodiest in the Western Theater. It was fought December 30th, 1862 through January 3rd, 1863, near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Murfreesboro at that time was it was the county seat of Rutherford County, but it was a rather small town of maybe a couple of thousand residents. If you go down to Murfreesboro today, it is a booming metropolis of 150,000 plus people. And it seems like every time we go down there, it's added a few thousand more, and there's been more development. Obviously, it being located in Middle Tennessee, it's essentially a suburb now of Nashville, which of course one of the fastest growing regions in the United States. The Stones River campaign had more than 81,000 participants from both armies, and over 25,000 of those soldiers became casualties by the time the action was all over. Stones River marked the third major engagement between these two armies. The first time what became the Army of the Cumberland and what became the Army of Tennessee, the first time these two armies clashed in real serious combat was at the Battle of Shiloh, which was April 6th and 7th, 1862. The Army of Ohio, then under General Don Carlos Buell, arrived on the Shiloh battlefield very late in the day on April 6th. I think one brigade of the Army made it across the river and took part in the end fighting on the April 6th. But several divisions of that Army moved across the Tennessee River on the night of the 6th and early morning of the 7th, and they took full part in the fighting of the 7th and acquitted themselves quite well. Their opponents throughout this battle was what was then known as the Army of Mississippi, which later would become the Army of Tennessee. So that was their first engagement, which was 23,000 casualties. So that was a highly significant engagement in the Western Theater. A few months later, these two armies clashed yet again at the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky, which was fought October 8th, 1862, really kind of the culminating event of Braxton Bragg's Kentucky campaign. This battle, too, was noted for its ferocity and high casualties. These two armies really fought for what maybe 4 to 5 hours, and in that time managed to rack up upwards of 8,000 casualties between the two armies. Safe to say, whenever the Army of the Cumberland and Army of Tennessee got within close proximity, these guys, their engagements generally would fall under what I would categorize as a slobber knocker. They usually battered each other so badly that they were unable to really follow up on any victory afterwards, because the armies were just, as I said, just so bludgeoned by the combat that these two armies engaged in. Both armies were, of course, characterized by the Western men that composed them. Of course, the Army of Tennessee was largely Tennesseans, but there was, quite a sprinkling in there of Alabamians and Mississippians. There were some troops from Georgia, some from Arkansas and Texas and Louisiana. And even the Carolinas. There was a couple of regiments from South Carolina at Stones River, several regiments from North Carolina. The only Confederate state that was not represented in the Army of Tennessee at Stones River was Virginia. The Army of the Cumberland, of course, had a large contingent of troops from Ohio, followed by Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. There were some troops from Missouri as well, a lot from Kentucky, even a few from Pennsylvania, Michigan, and I think there was even an artillery battery from Minnesota. So really, the character of these armies was stamped by their origin. They came out of predominantly the middle western region of the United States. As far as their commanders, Stones River was the first of 3 campaigns that Braxton Bragg and William S. Rosecrans would wage against one another. Braxton Bragg, kind of a very polarizing figure in Civil War history. had assumed command of the then Army of Mississippi in June 1862. He took over the Army at the direction of President Jefferson Davis when General P.G.T. Beauregard went off to Alabama on his rest cure without orders. Davis relieved Beauregard essentially on the spot and put Bragg in his place. Bragg really didn't want the job, but he did take command and really kind of led what I'd call the Tupelo revival of that army, such that within a couple of months of him taking command, that army is starting to march north into Kentucky on the storied Kentucky campaign. So that said, by the time of Stones River, Braxton Bragg has been in the command of the Army of Tennessee for a better part of 6 months. He had a campaign under his belt. He had some experience as a corps commander at Shiloh. William S. Rosecrans, on the other hand, had won a couple of battles with kind of smaller commands, predominantly at the battles of Iuka and Corinth in September and October of 1862. The Lincoln administration had grown increasingly disheartened with Don Carlos Buell as the summer led into fall of 1862. And when Bragg and Kirby Smith's armies were tromping around Kentucky, the Lincoln administration at one point actually fired Buell and wanted to appoint George Thomas in his place. Thomas kind of begged off the assignment, and the government ended up backing off for a period of time. But after the Confederates started leaving Kentucky after the Battle of Perryville, Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton expected Buell to follow Bragg into eastern Kentucky and then into eastern Tennessee. There were a lot of eastern Tennessee Unionists that the administration was very interested in relieving from their troubles under the Confederacy. And Buell threw out all sorts of reasons why he could not follow Bragg into eastern Tennessee. And after a week or so of exchanging notes with Halleck and Stanton, Buell found himself relieved from command, and William S. Rosecrans had taken over. Bragg and Rosecrans, of course, were both West Pointers. Bragg graduated with the class of 1837, went into an artillery assignment, and really developed quite a reputation in the Army as probably the most irascible lieutenant in the service. But the Mexican War proved he was quite a gallant and brave artillery commander. Earned 3 brevets for bravery during the war. So by the time the Mexican War is over, he has a brevet promotion to lieutenant colonel. William S. Rosecrans, a native of Ohio, had graduated with the West Point class of 1843, I think. He graduated 5th in his class and went off to the engineering corps. Braxton Bragg had also graduated 5th in his class just a few years earlier. Rosecrans missed active service in the Mexican War. He was on engineering assignments on the East Coast, places like Newport, Rhode Island. I think he was in Norfolk, Virginia for a period of time, and then resigned his commission in the mid-1850s to go into business in Cincinnati. Braxton Bragg also left the Army around that same time. He resigned his commission, I think, at the end of 1855. He had been proposing a number of artillery reforms that then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis kept nixing, and Bragg kind of got fed up with Army politics and with really not being able to make any improvements in his chosen profession. And the second piece of that was he had also married. His wife was the heir to a Louisiana plantation and was rather wealthy. So after he resigned from the Army, Braxton Bragg and his wife purchased a sugar plantation. And by the beginning of the war, he was turning a $30,000 a year profit, which in 1860 money was, he was doing quite well for himself. Of course, he joins the Confederacy as the commanding general of the Louisiana state troops when Louisiana secedes, and then works his way up into the Army. William S. Rosecrans starts the war. He is, I won't say penniless, but he's in rather dire straits financially. His business enterprises have generally not worked out. He was working with something called coal oil, which we today call kerosene. And while experimenting with that, one of his flasks exploded, and the right side of his face was rather severely burned. You might notice most photographs of Rosecrans have the right side of his face away from the camera. He was very particular about how his photograph was taken and was very rather shy about the scarring that he had had on that side of the face. And often wore the beard helped conceal it, but you will find very few photographs where he's showing the right side of his face. That said, the Stones River campaign was the first of three between these two generals. Stones River, 6 months later, they would fight the Tullahoma campaign, where Rosecrans successfully wedged Braxton Bragg out of Middle Tennessee. And then, of course, the last campaign that they fought was the bloodiest battle in the Western Theater, the Battle of Chickamauga, which was fought in September 1863. The goal of each one of these campaigns was the control of Middle Tennessee and ultimately Chattanooga, which was the gateway to the Confederate heartland. So the story of Stones River has been told before by other authors. Peter Cousins, in particular, wrote a book in the late '80s, early 1990s. No Better Place to Die. It's kind of become the standard book on the battle. Larry Daniel put out a really fine book about 2012 about the battle. So their previous authors have covered Stones River. So as I was thinking about writing about this campaign, I wanted to take a new approach. And in the course of doing the research, I came across something that Sam Watkins had written, and it really spoke to me, and it really became the mission statement of Hell by the Acre. Sam Watkins, of course, was very well known. His memoir was extensively quoted in Ken Burns' Civil War series back in the early 1990s. He had served in the 1st Tennessee Infantry throughout the war. He was wounded at Stones River. I think he was wounded twice, memory serves, when he was trying to charge across the Wilkinson Pike on the morning of December 31st. But one of the things he said was that he noted that the histories of the war are all written out by the big bugs, generals, and renowned historians. But he declared that he had as much right as anyone to pen a history. And he said, I propose to tell of the fellows who did the shooting and the killing, the fortifying and the ditching, the sweeping of the streets, the drilling, standing guard, who drew the ramrod and tore the cartridge. While prior studies have generally adopted what I'll call a top-down approach to describing this campaign, generally viewing it through the eyes of the leading generals and politicians and whatnot, to kind of describe what the battle was and what it meant. I kept pondering Sam Watkins' statement here, and as I said, it became the mission statement for this book. My goal became to complement these prior studies by really focusing on what the ground level actions of the officers and men in the ranks, and really putting what they had to say about the battle on a bit of a silver platter, really kind of serving that up in a way, trying to make the history of the battle more democratic with a small d, trying to make sure that we're incorporating the voices of men up and down the order of battle, up and down from the highest generals down to the men in the ranks, to really kind of get their experience and get their perspective on what this battle was like. So there's a lot of focus in the book on company level officers and enlisted men. What I have here is a period depiction of Colonel Sam Beatty's Federal Brigade going into action on December 31st, 1862. You'll see the Confederates off in the trees here, and Beatty's brigade is lined up in two lines. The one I really want to focus in on is up here. We focused in on is a company, probably Company A, of the 19th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. You can see the men arrayed in two ranks. They have their bayonets fixed, and they're in various stages of loading and discharging their weapons at the enemy, who's really not very far away. And you can see the company officers behind the men with their swords drawn, encouraging them in the fight. And previous studies had mentioned or focused on what did Colonel Beatty report about this particular action? What was his perspective on what happened here? Sometimes those studies might even have gone down and quoted something from Major Charles Manderson, who is pictured here. Later was a senator from the state of Nebraska. They might have quoted what he had to say about what happened in the action, but for me, I really wanted to see what did Corporal Henry Clay Elston of the 19th Ohio, what did he have to say about this engagement, and how was that perhaps similar or perhaps different from the perspective of his commanding officers? So as you read through the book, you'll notice that there is a lot of emphasis on giving the privates, corporals, sergeants, and lieutenants an opportunity to describe what it is they're experiencing, and then blending that in, of course, with the official reports and whatnot. It's really exciting for me to kind of take this approach because while we're describing what amounts to familiar events, it's like another facet of the jewel that maybe we haven't really looked at before, not really looked through that prism. So it kind of gives us a different perspective. Another thing that I wanted to highlight, and something that's definitely featured in the book, is that during the Stones River campaign, uh, there were 10 medals of honor awarded to men for actions during that campaign. Now, previous books might have made some mention of these occurrences, but to me, given that this is the highest honor that we give our men and women in the armed services, really wanted to take a little bit more space and time in the narrative to kind of spec out a little bit of how these how it came that these men were awarded these. What specifically were their actions that were so notable that they were later awarded the Medal of Honor? So as you read through the narrative, you'll find that their stories are highlighted, and you get a little more detail about how these medals came about, and really how important their contribution really was. Another exciting thing for me was being able to utilize the missing after action reports that were written by the regimental and brigade commanders of General Jones Withers' division in the Army of Tennessee. And I'm going to give all the credit here to Lanny Smith. He was a historian who himself wrote a 2-volume history of the Stones River campaign. Phenomenal work, kind of hard to find. He didn't print very many of them. If you can find one of them on eBay or on a secondary book market, they generally go for several $100s, and they're worth every penny. They're exceptional books. Well, one of the things that Lanny had discovered in the early 2000s while perusing through the Braxton Bragg papers up at Western Reserve Historical Society here in Ohio was that there was this whole stack of Stones River after action reports that never made it into the official records and never made it into the supplement to the official records, which Broadfoot published in the 1990s. Lanny went through and painstakingly transcribed these reports. They're all handwritten. He transcribed them and he published them in his Confederate volume back in 2000, around 2010. I was able to use these to help write the narrative of Hell by the Acre. Really, the first time that a historian had been able to use these and kind of incorporating them into the broader story of Stones River. Some of these reports are relatively short, and some of them are masterpieces of this is how you write an after action report. Some of them are that good. And what they really do is they kind of open up a whole new vista for a historian of how to interpret really the middle portion of the Battle of Stones River. I'd say from about 10 o'clock until 10 o'clock in the morning until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, because that's primarily when most of these brigades went into action. Now, it's not that we've not had any accounts from any of these troops before, but we've certainly not had their official reports, which, as I said, some of them are exceptionally good. And it was really exciting for me also to be able to incorporate this into the narrative really kind of for the first time, and to really kind of help reinterpret a bit of how the various Confederate attacks developed during that critical middle period. And as I said, in total, there are 33 missing reports that Lanny found, and that we were able to incorporate significant portions of them into the book. So that to me also was kind of an exciting and new aspect to the book. So that said, that allows us to kind of rethink the Confederate assault on the Cedars. What we have depicted here is the fighting right around 11 a.m. on December 31st. The units that we didn't have reports for before, predominantly Anderson's brigade here of Mississippi and 1 Alabama regiment, and then Chalmers' brigade, which made the first assault on the Round Forest. And it's combining the official records with the stories of the men in the ranks really puts a lot of meat around the bones, so to speak, about how those attacks developed and ultimately how both of them failed. You know, the Anderson's brigade in particular made that charge against what is now tour stop number 2. So I'll take Colonel Autry's picture off. If you go to the Stones River battlefield today, McFadden Lane today is exactly the same place it was during the battle. And tour stop number 2 is right in this vicinity. Those limestone outcroppings that I'm sure many of you have walked through are right in this area. And Anderson's assault, I think, is certainly one of the bloodiest of the battle, and certainly one of the most poignant. His regiment, or his brigade rather, of 5 regiments, marched against really the Union defensive position here was quite good. There was multiple artillery batteries that he was contending with. He led his brigade in this attack. I'd say it's probably closer to 1030. And this brigade suffered enormous casualties. The 29th and 30th Mississippi in particular just really took it on the chin. One of them, and I think it was the 29th, lost 63 killed and 139 wounded. The 30th Mississippi, I think, lost around 30 or 35 killed and 202 wounded. And all of this happened in the span of about a half an hour. It was they essentially marched out of the trees. They marched into this open field, and the Federals just took them under very heavy fire. The attack bogged down in the middle of the field, and then essentially they fell back. But as I said, they just left the ground carpeted with Mississippians. So when we think of Stones River, sometimes they talk about the area in front of the Round Forest as being Hell's Half Acre or the Mississippians' Half Acre. I'd offer that there are several locations at Stones River where you could use that title and do it justice. As I said, one of the officers that was killed here was Lieutenant Colonel James Autry of the 27th Mississippi. Read a bit in the book of what the situation was with his demise and really what it meant to the brigade. The other unit that we really get to focus in on is Chalmers Brigade, which is located up here in the upper right. This is the Round Forest, where Hazen's brigade pretty much held their ground all day. First Confederates to charge against them was Chalmers Brigade about 10 o'clock in the morning on December 31st, and you'll get to read in detail what that experience was like for them. And here's a photograph of some of the men that were in that charge. This is a squad of men from Company B of the 9th Mississippi. Obviously, this is a very early war image. This was taken when they were camped down, and I think it was in Pensacola in the spring of '61. The other thing that for me was exciting was really rethinking the dramatic close to the Battle of Stones River. I think most folks would be familiar with Breckinridge's assault, which took place in the late afternoon, early evening of January 2nd, 1863. This was an attempt on Braxton Bragg's part to break the Federal hold on Stones River. He'd been looking for ways to get Rosecrans to depart the battlefield, since essentially winning most of the field on December 31st. I guess we really didn't go into too much detail about how the battle developed. But on December 31st, the Federal line stretched about 3 miles in length. Bragg launched a dawn assault against the Union right, and in a series of increasingly brutal attacks and assaults, was able to essentially bend the Federal Army back upon itself, almost like a jackknife. The Federal Army was able to hold on to the Nashville Pike, which was, of course, their road connection with their supply base at Nashville. And as the fighting petered out on December 31st, the Confederate Army had seized lots of ground. They took 29 federal cannon, several thousand prisoners, a half dozen battle flags, but they could not break the Federal hold on the Nashville Pike. And as the fighting ended, Bragg was in his mind was sure that Rosecrans would retreat overnight, and was rather surprised to wake up the next morning and find the Federal Army not only still in position, but now pretty heftily entrenched. And the remainder of the battle was that January 1st was kind of a waiting game. There were some minor actions that went on, but it wasn't until January 2nd that Bragg decided it was time to kind of break the stalemate and launch this assault. The intention of the assault was to take this high ground here where you see it says Van Cleve's division. There was a couple of federal brigades that had crossed Stones River on January 1st. And the reason they had done that, they were following through on Rosecrans' original battle plan. His intention on December 31st was to cross a division here at McFadden's Ford and then seize the town of Murfreesboro itself, which had Braxton Bragg's railroad connection to Chattanooga. And Rosecrans' thought was if he could seize the railroad, that would force Bragg to retreat to the south. So as we move into January 2nd, he's got the better part of a division on this side of the river, and he's essentially waiting for ammunition and some more reinforcements to arrive from Nashville. Those are expected to arrive on January 3rd. The thought was that the Army would either make this assault on January 3rd or January 4th. As things developed, Bragg seized this ground, which we in the book we call Beatty's Ridge. It really doesn't have a name today. Today it's a residential neighborhood. And he sees this ground and sees an opportunity to utilize his artillery, which had not really been, he really hadn't a chance to get much of his artillery into the action through most of the battle, really due to the nature of the ground, in particular the cedars. And he sees that if he could get on this high ground, which does command this area over here known as McFadden's Heights, that he might be able to get some cannons arrayed such that he could start striking the Federal rear and maybe compel Rosecrans to leave. It was a bit of a surprise when it was discovered that the Federals had already taken this ground, and the Breckinridge's assault was intended to drive them off, and it was going to be done late enough in the day that by the time the Confederates had seized this ground, it would be almost sunset. The Federals wouldn't have time enough to organize a counterattack. I mean, night attacks during the Civil War were almost unheard of. So, Bragg was trying to employ a bit of clever strategery here. He might have been a little too clever by half. Breckinridge's assault does kick off around 3:30 or 3:45 in the afternoon. And within 20 minutes, they have successfully driven the Federals off of Beatty's Ridge. Bragg's original orders were to drive the Federals off Beatty's Ridge, hunker down, I'm going to bring up artillery, and you just get up there and you get yourself entrenched. Now, they knew they were going to take Federal artillery fire, but they were confident that they could hold the ground until nightfall, and then during the course of the night, a whole slew of batteries would be brought up and arrayed on this ridge so that they could open fire essentially on the Nashville Pike in the rear of the Federal Army. As I said, Breckinridge's assault succeeds. He does drive the Federals off this ridge, but they commit really the fatal blunder of the attack was as the Federals start retreating towards Stones River, the Confederates, following, good military principle, when your enemy's on the run, you keep after them, they overran the objective. And as they did, they start going into the really the bottom lands of the river here, and they do come under fire from Federal artillery. John Mendenhall, of course, had famously, once the attack started gathering up additional batteries to put into line here. One point to make was Bragg did manage to get a couple of artillery batteries up on Beatty's Ridge, and they were up there long enough that they compelled two of these Federal batteries to retreat, and that was before the Confederate assault was repulsed. Had they had more time, I really think Rosecrans would have not been able to drive him off this ridge without really taking horrendous casualties in so doing. But that wasn't how it developed. As I said, the Confederates overran the eject of the infantry in particular. These artillery batteries open on them. The attack starts to fall apart. And then Colonel John Miller, who was commanding this mixed brigade of Ohioans, Indianans, and Pennsylvanians, sees that there's an opportunity with really the Confederate attack starting to flounder. He elects to, really on his own authority, to conduct a counterattack across the river. He convinces Timothy Stanley, who's commanding the other brigade in Negley's division, to support him. And these two brigades charge across Stones River, and really that combined with the massed artillery that was just dropping all sorts of shells into this area, they actually compel Breckinridge's division to fall back, first to the ridge, and then eventually all the way south here to where they started out on Wayne's Hill. It's worth noting that what I have just described to you, this engagement was begun and over within about 45 minutes. And in those 45 minutes, Breckinridge's division lost 1,800 casualties. It was a bloodbath. And it really finally broke the Confederate hold on Murfreesboro. The following day, Bragg does come to the decision that it's time for the army to retreat, and they end up moving about 30 miles south, places around Winchester and whatnot, really at the edge of what they call the Highland Rim in Middle Tennessee. So that said, Stones River was a Federal victory, but it was an extraordinarily close affair. And I think really the decisive moment came here when Breckinridge's assault was repulsed, and that really kind of told the tale for the rest of the engagement. I think it's been one of the questions about Stones River is, why has it really not been that many books written about it? To me, it's a fascinating battle. It certainly has lots of interesting stories and facets and whatnot to it. But I think that the predominant thought has been that with Stones River, few battles ever cost more or meant less. I think Bruce Catton might have wrote that back in the 1960s. And I did rather disagree with that, but I can understand why someone would think that. I mean, essentially after Stones River, both armies spent the next 6 months in camp kind of recovering from the bludgeoning they had given one another. The battle, it did take over, move the Federal lines 30 miles south of Murfreesboro, but at an enormous cost. But I think Stones River's importance really lies within the context in which it occurred. We got to remember this happened at the end of 1862, the beginning of 1863. The Lincoln administration had directed the Federal armies to really kind of make I'll call it a national offensive. To one of the biggest concerns that the administration had was that British Parliament would be coming into session in January, and they didn't want there to be any thought on the part of the English that maybe they should intervene. And one of the ways to ensure that is to make sure that the Federal Army appears to be winning the war. So there, of course, there was the effort at Fredericksburg, which for the Army of the Potomac was probably their most discouraging defeat. That happened 2 weeks before Stones River. While Stones River is going on, further west, you have General Ulysses S. Grant launching a two-pronged invasion of Mississippi. There was a land-borne expedition that was under his personal command that was kind of undone when Earl Van Dorn destroyed his supply depot at Holly Springs on December 20th. And then there was a waterborne expedition that William Tecumseh Sherman led. And it was the idea was they would go down the Mississippi River, sail a short distance up the Yazoo River, and then take Vicksburg essentially from the rear That offensive came to a grinding halt at a place called Chickasaw Bayou. Chickasaw Bayou was a Confederate, a very lopsided Confederate victory. The Federal Army, it was sometimes called the Fredericksburg of the West. The Federal Army lost upwards of 2,000 casualties. The Confederates only about 200 and weren't budged an inch from their defensive grounds. So both of those efforts have kind of come to naught. And it really kind of fell to William S. Rosecrans to kind of secure the victory. And, looking at Stones River, what would have happened had the Union Army been defeated here? And they came very close to it, definitely on December 31st and even potentially on January 2nd. What if the Union Army had lost at Stones River and they had been defeated at Fredericksburg and Vicksburg as well? Where does that leave the Union cause? I mean, this was already really the low point of the war for the Union war effort. I mean, desertions were starting to really become a problem. War weariness was certainly a problem in the North. The 1862 elections had by and large gone against the administration. A lot of it was, folks were very unhappy with how things were going with the war. There have been a lot of casualties and it didn't seem like we were making any progress in defeating the Confederacy. What effect does this have if Stones River is a defeat? What's that have on the Emancipation Proclamation, which is going into effect as the battle is being fought? It goes into effect January 1st, 1863. How much faith do people put in the emancipation if the Union Army is being defeated from pillar to post? And what does this do for international recognition of the Confederacy? What if English Parliament goes into session in January and the Confederacy is winning battle after battle after battle? Does that change their calculus of whether they intervene or not? President Lincoln certainly had an opinion about this, and as he wrote to Rosecrans several months later, he valued Stones River a great deal. And he said, "I could never forget, whilst I remember anything, that you gave us a hard-earned victory, which had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over." So that's how important he thought Stones River was. One of the things too is, as I wrote the book, I'm very hopeful that as folks read it, they have an emotional reaction to what they read, and they also really like to light the fires for preservation. What I have highlighted here, this red circle, is the lion's share of the Stones River National Battlefield as it exists today. There are some other properties further up on the Nashville Pike and further south, and of course over by McFadden's Ford. But this is largely what has been preserved today. It might be a total of 20 or 25% of the whole battlefield. That said, there are still preservation opportunities. I have this particular plot of land highlighted here largely because it's not been built upon yet, which is in Murfreesboro is rather unusual. Development is kind of going at a fast and furious pace down there. One would ask though, okay, well, it's a big open plot of land. Did anything happen there? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, quite a bit happened there. Some very important fighting that occurred near the Asbury Road around noon on December 31st took place on this very ground. So I would offer that there are still preservation opportunities at Stones River, but time is probably not on our side if we're going to make any kind of substantial moves here. That we probably need to do those within the next couple of years. If we do not, I fear that this entire area will be turned into neighborhoods and whatnot, because that's what happened at most other places around the battlefield. So that said, I do hope that Hell by the Acre helps inspire you a bit to help in these efforts, as opportunity arises. So that said, I'm going to wrap up my presentation on Hell by the Acre. I hope you have enjoyed it. The book is available now. I have copies directly. If you send me a private message or an email, we'll work that out. You can also buy the book directly from the Savas Beatty website. The Stones River National Battlefield Park Store also has copies on hand if you'd like to kind of help them with their park preservation activities. And if you must, you can also buy it from Amazon. But as I just checked before Before we broadcast here, they were down to 15 copies. So they don't have a whole lot left. I'd encourage you to buy from one of these other sources. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.